Hey guys, so with the finale to Australian Survivor Heroes vs. Villains right around the corner, it is now time to break down the jury scenarios, where I'll go through each possible final two combination based on how likely I think it is to happen, and to forecast how I think the jury vote would break down if those scenarios were to happen. Now at the time of recording, there are 4 players left in the game, those being George, Gerry, Liz, and Matt, and assuming we end the season with a final 2, that would give us a jury of 9. Now, before we get started, I want to talk a bit about the remaining contenders and talk more generally about this jury. So as I explained in my recent power ranking, I do believe that George and Liz are by far the most likely to actually win the game based on their edit, as well as their game position, where I feel like George is clearly the jury favorite, where I feel like he would beat pretty much everyone left in the game. And I feel like if George were to be taken out before the end, that Liz would be the most likely to inherit a lot of the credit for the moves that George and his alliances were making throughout the game. Now, not to say that Matt and Gerry can't get jury votes, as obviously they can end up in a final 2 together. However, I feel like if either of them are at the end against George or Liz, that they'll more than likely lose. And moving over to the jury, which is 5 original heroes and 2 original villains, and also all of them are returnees, which is pretty funny, considering that during the pre-merge, most of the vote outs were newbies, so it's funny seeing how the tide has turned here to where literally George is the only returnee left in the game. But I feel like there will be several dynamics that will define this jury vote based on the people currently on it. So first up, you have the core hero alliance, which consists of Sean, Sam, and Flick, where I'm pretty confident that Sam and Sean will vote together. I feel like they're viewing the remaining players pretty similarly, and I feel like they'll just go with each other. Flick is someone who I think will mostly go along with them. However, I could see her having a bit more of a mind of her own, so that'll be interesting to see. And I also think these 3 will be the least happy to vote for George, given that they talk in pretty openly about George's lackluster jury management. And they also spent the least amount of time in the game with George. They talked about George's less than ideal social game as well. And they were one of the most vocal people in supporting Simon while he was still in the game. So I feel like while they'll acknowledge that George played the best game of these 4, that they'll definitely be the least happy with him and could be the most open to voting for other options, even if George were to get to the end. But then we move on to Haley and Simon, who I think will be the biggest George supporters out there, where Haley had a pretty good relationship with George before the game, and while Simon was George's rival throughout the season, he was very complimentary of George on his way out, and I feel like Simon will respect the game that George played. Same thing with Haley, so I feel like if George gets to the end, he's very likely to get their votes. Then we move on to Nina, who I think will be a likely George vote or a Liz vote, depending on which one gets to the end. And I feel like she'll generally vote with the heroes. However, similar to Flick, I feel like she'll be more independent compared to someone like a Sam and Sean. And then we get to Shonee, who I think is the biggest swing vote so far, where I don't know who she prefers over George or Liz, where on one hand, she did have a pretty good relationship with both of them, and plus I think she can recognize that George was the one to take her out. However, I think Shonee also has a closer relationship with Liz, of course, and plus she could feel a bit burned by George, considering that she saw him as a shield. She may think that he owes her for getting him as deep into the game as he did, given the big threat that he was coming into the season. So I'm not entirely sure where Shonee will land by the end of it, but more than likely I think she'll respect gameplay more than anything else. So that's where I'm thinking the jury will land by the end, and obviously the final 2 people to join the jury will play a big factor as well. But with that said, there are 6 possible final 2 scenarios to get into here, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 6, the final 2 scenario I think is the least likely to happen is George versus Matt. And really, I don't see this one happening. Really, I don't think Matt is getting to the end based on his edit. And plus, I feel like the things that would need to happen for this final 2 seem pretty unlikely, where on one hand, I don't think George would want to take Matt to the end. I think he would try to cut Matt at the first opportunity he doesn't win immunity, given Matt has won the last few immunities. And plus, I think of the people still in the game, George perceives Matt to be his biggest threat, to where Matt is an original hero and could get those votes just inherently. But even outside that, just him winning immunity could also garner him some respect. And on the other hand, I think Matt sees George as his biggest threat, to where if Matt does win out and has the choice to choose between George, Gerry, or Liz, that he's going to try to take out George and try to claim credit for that and put a move on his resume. So either way, I don't think either of these two would take each other to the end if they're given the chance. Now, if this final two were to happen, I think George would have the advantage. I feel like most people would recognize that George played the better game to where he would get most of the jury votes. Now, I think Sean and Sam would be more open to voting for Matt given they were aligned with Matt in the pre merge. However, even then, they may not fully understand why Matt flipped at the merge and stayed there despite having the chance to go to them. So I feel like because of that, George is more than likely going to win this scenario. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's going to happen. So because of that, it is here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and we have another scenario that's pretty unlikely. But here we have Liz versus Matt. And again, I feel like this one's pretty unlikely as well, given Matt's edit. However, I think it's a bit more likely than the George one because there is a shot that Liz could choose Matt over George if, say, Matt were to win Final 4 immunity and she were to win Final 3 immunity. Or possibly, if Matt were to win that Final 3 immunity, that he would pick Liz over George, given that Liz is a bit more subdued than George. Now, if this scenario were to happen, I still think Liz would win. However, I think Matt would have more of a shot here compared to being against George. Where I think in this scenario, he would get the votes of Sam and Sean. I think they would be less likely to respect Liz's game than George. In that regard, they would probably take Matt over Liz. I also think Flick could be up in the air as well, to where she did have more of a relationship with Liz. However, I could also see her voting for Matt, especially if Matt were to win out in this case. And I think Matt would also get the vote of Gerry, given he had a better relationship with Matt compared to Liz. However, I think Liz would get the other votes, where she for sure gets Shawnee's vote, as well as George's, and I think she would also get the votes of the more strategically minded people, so Haley and Simon. So I think in that regard, Liz would win this final two. However, it would be closer than the George versus Matt scenario. But at the end, I don't think Matt's getting to the end, which is why I have this here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have the top rated scenario with Matt in it, but here we have Gerry versus Matt. And I think if Matt were to get to the end, this would probably be the route he would take, given that Matt would see Gerry as his easiest win. And I think it's pretty viable to happen where, say, he wins out Final 4, take out George or Liz, wins Final 3 immunity, takes out the other one, and through that Matt gets to the end with Gerry. And I think in this scenario, Matt would win pretty decisively, where I feel like the only vote that could go to Gerry would be George, given their relationship. But even then, I could see George just voting for Matt, given that George would see Matt as being the better player, and probably the one that took him out to where he would respect Matt because of that. But really, I don't think the scenario is likely, given that I don't think Matt's getting to the end. So because of that, I think it's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and I'm sure the scenario is a bit higher than you might be expecting, even though I don't think it's super likely. But here we have George versus Liz. Now, I think there is a path for this one to happen where, let's say that Matt wins Final 4 and George takes out Gerry in this case to improve his odds of being Matt in a Final 3. I think George would be inclined to take Liz to the end, as he feels like Matt would have more of a case to beat him in a jury vote, given that he sees Matt as his biggest threat, whereas he feels like Liz is someone that played a pretty similar game to him. However, he would be probably better suited to articulate why he outplayed Liz to paint Liz as his follower, per se. So I think there is a path for this to happen if George is the one with the ability to make it happen. Whereas I feel like Liz is pretty unlikely to take George to the end. I think if she has a chance, she would cut George to where this scenario is a bit lower on the list. But if this scenario were to happen, I'll admit, this is probably the toughest one to forecast. I do think George would win here. However, there are definitely some votes that could go to Liz. So first up, you have the heroes, you have Sam and Sean, where you would think that they would vote for Liz simply because they weren't happy with George. However, I think they also didn't have much of a relationship with Liz to begin with, and could just see Liz as an extension of George and would have similar complaints with them. So I think to that end, they would probably lean George, as they would probably see George as the better player there. However, it could be up in the air. I think Flick would probably be a likely vote for George, given their pre-game relationship. I think Haley and Simon would be pretty locked in votes for George. I think they would see George as being the better player there. I think Gerry and Matt would be very likely George votes as well. So that already gives George the win. Now, I think the other swing votes here are Nina and Shonee, where I'm not sure where Nina would go. I think she would lean George. However, she also has a good relationship with Liz, given their alliance. And then we have Shonee, who I mentioned earlier in the video, where I don't know who she votes for between George and Liz, where I mentioned that she had a closer relationship with Liz and would probably see Liz as her mentor and plus the person that didn't burn her compared to George. And she could also see George as only being there because she dragged him along. However, I also think that this is a weird scenario because in this case, Liz didn't avenge Shonee. She didn't take the shot at George when she probably was expecting that. And plus, I think she would recognize that George simply outplayed her by the end of it to where he outgrew his role as being a shield. So I could see it going either way, but I still think it would be enough to give George the win, even without Shawnee's vote. So I do think George would win in this scenario, and personally, I would prefer it. However, I will also acknowledge that this scenario is a bit tough to forecast, so because of that, it is here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and if you had asked me last week, I probably would have had this scenario at number 1. However, with my recent change to my power rankings, I did bump it to number 2, but here we have Gerry versus Liz, and this one's relatively straightforward, where Matt gets taken out at 4. Final 3, it's Gerry versus George versus Liz in that final immunity challenge. Liz wins, takes out George, and gets this. And I think in this scenario, Liz would win almost unanimously, where the only vote I could see going for Gerry is Matt, given their relationship. But I feel like every other vote will go for Liz. Even George, who has a good relationship with Gerry, would recognize that Liz played the better game, throw his vote there. I feel like if Liz wins the season, that this is the most likely path that she would take, which is why the scenario is as high as it is. However, I feel like the number 1 scenario is more likely with how I'm seeing the season playing out, which is why I have it here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the final 2 scenario I think is the most likely to happen is George versus Gerry. And this sort of ties into why I had George at number 1 in my power ranking, where we saw in the most recent episode that George and Gerry had this very close relationship. And it made me think that part of the reason why they presented it like that is to explain why George and Gerry are the final 2 of the season. And I feel like if George were to win the game, this would be the most likely path he would take, where he would, again, take out Matt at Final 4. Final 3 is a bit tough, where he would more than likely need to win Final Immunity, although even then, he could also rely on Gerry winning Final Immunity. And I think Gerry would take George to the end. I think George would cut Liz in order to go to the end with Gerry, as he would see Gerry as his easier beat. And sure enough, I think that's what would happen in this scenario, where I think George might win unanimously in this scenario, where I don't think there's anyone that would consider voting for Gerry over George. Even the people that aren't happy with George don't really respect Gerry's game that much, or at least I don't think so based on the evidence that I have, to where I think George would hands down win this scenario, and I think George would recognize that as well, which is why I think he would try to pursue it. Now, granted, this would be largely dependent on Liz not winning Final Immunity. However, I think there is a shot that it could happen, even though Liz seems to be better equipped to win Final Immunity. I think this scenario just makes the most sense given the edit, or at least the way I'm reading the edit. However, I will acknowledge that there's a shot that George just loses, to where Liz would just occupy this spot and cause my number 2 scenario to be the reality. But I feel like based on how I'm feeling going into this finale, I think George is the most likely to win. I think this is the person he would take. And because of that, we have this scenario here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Now, after the season ends, I'll be doing my player ranking and season review, so stay tuned for that. I'm currently covering Survivor 44 and Big Brother Canada, so you can expect coverage of those shows. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which I'll leave a link to join in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.